April 6th, 1917. The mahogany doors of the House chamber swung shut with a resonance that seemed to echo through history itself. President Woodrow Wilson had just delivered his war message to Congress, his voice trembling with conviction as he proclaimed that the world must be made safe for democracy. In the gallery above, reporters scribbled furiously, capturing what they believed was the complete story of America's entry into the Great War. But in the shadows of that historic moment, invisible to the press and forgotten by time, stood the architects of a different narrative entirely. Men whose decisions would send hundreds of thousands of young Americans across an ocean to fight a war that most of them could barely locate on a map. What those reporters didn't know, what the history books would never record, was that the real story of America's Great War had begun months earlier in the private offices of Wall Street bankers, in the segregated training camps of the Deep South, and in the propaganda bureaus where truth itself was being weaponized. The war that America thought it was fighting and the war that America actually fought were two entirely different conflicts. One was noble and righteous, told in parades and monuments. The other was brutal and calculating, buried in classified files and forgotten testimonies. And that was the moment the entire war shifted, though almost no one realized it at the time. This video examines published sources for educational purposes. Interpretations are attributed. No claims are asserted as fact without citation. Before we uncover today's secret from the pages of military history, if you enjoy exploring the hidden stories, decisive battles, and overlooked moments that shaped our world, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe for more untold wartime histories. And let me know in the comments where you're watching from. I'm always amazed how these memories of the past connect us across so many corners of the world. The story they taught you about World War I was a lie. Not entirely, but enough to matter. Enough to hide one of the most systematic campaigns of deception, exploitation, and social engineering in American history. While textbooks celebrate the doughboys marching off to make the world safe for democracy, the real story involves financial conspiracies that would make modern Wall Street blush, propaganda operations that redefine truth itself, and a level of racial injustice so profound that it makes the civil rights struggles of the 1960s seem like a natural continuation rather than a new beginning. According to historian David M. Kennedy's comprehensive analysis in Over Here, the First World War, and American Society, the America that entered World War I in April 1917 bore little resemblance to the America that emerged in November 1918. The transformation was so complete, so fundamental, that it represented nothing less than the birth of the modern American state. But that transformation came at a cost that has been carefully scrubbed from popular memory. The financial motivations behind America's entry into the conflict represent perhaps the most documented yet least discussed aspect of the entire war. Records from the Federal Reserve indicate that by 1917, American banks had loaned over $2 billion to the Allied powers, primarily Britain and France. J.P. Morgan alone had extended credits worth more than $1.5 billion. These weren't charitable gestures or expressions of democratic solidarity. They were calculated that investments that would become worthless if Germany won the war. Some historians argue that this financial entanglement created what economist Charles Callan Tansel described in America Goes to War as an economic imperative for American intervention. The alternative was a financial catastrophe that would have dwarfed the panic of 1907. When German submarines began threatening the merchant vessels carrying American goods to Allied ports, they weren't just attacking ships. They were attacking the foundation of American prosperity. The Black Tom explosion of July 30th, 1916, demonstrated just how far this financial web extended into American daily life. German saboteurs detonated £2 million of ammunition stored on Black Tom Island in New York Harbor, creating an explosion so massive that it shattered windows in Times Square and damaged the Statue of Liberty. The attack targeted munitions bound for Allied forces, munitions that represented millions of dollars in American industrial profits. According to the Federal Bureau of Investigation's historical records, this was the first major terrorist attack on American soil by foreign agents. Yet, it has been largely forgotten because acknowledging it would require acknowledging the commercial nature of America's supposed neutrality. What followed was perhaps the most sophisticated propaganda campaign in human history to that point. President Wilson created the Committee on Public Information under George Creel, an operation that historian David Welch noted in Germany, propaganda and total war represented the first systematic attempt by a democratic government to manufacture public opinion on a national scale. The CPI employed over 75,000 speakers known as 4-minute men, who delivered carefully crafted messages in movie theatres, churches and public gatherings across the country. These weren't casual, patriotic speeches. They were scientifically designed psychological operations based on the emerging field of mass psychology. Edward Bernays, who worked for the CPI and later founded the modern public relations industry, wrote in his memoir, Biography of an Idea, that the war taught him how human emotions could be manipulated on an industrial scale. The techniques developed to sell Americans on the war would later be used to sell them everything from cigarettes to presidential candidates. The CPI's domestic operations were matched by an international propaganda network that stretched from Moscow to Beijing. In Russia, CPI operatives spread false information about Bolshevik connections to Germany, contributing to the chaos that would eventually bring down the provisional government. In Latin America, they planted stories in local newspapers that painted Germany as a threat to hemispheric security. These weren't diplomatic initiatives. They were covert psychological warfare operations that violated every principle of international law that America claimed to uphold. Meanwhile, on American soil, the war unleashed forces of repression that make modern concerns about civil liberties seem almost quaint by comparison. The Espionage Act of 1917 and the Sedition Act of 1918 created what historian Christopher Capozzola described in Uncle Sam Wants You as a legal framework for prosecuting dissent itself. Over 2,000 Americans were arrested and more than 1,000 convicted for crimes that amounted to nothing more than expressing opposition to the war. Eugene V. Debs, the Socialist Party leader who had received nearly 1 million votes for president in 1912, was sentenced to 10 years in federal prison for a speech in which he criticized the war. His crime was not espionage or sabotage, but simply arguing that the conflict served the interests of the wealthy at the expense of the working class. From his prison cell in Atlanta Federal Penitentiary, Debs received over 900,000 votes for president in 1920, a testament to how many Americans understood that something fundamental had gone wrong with their democracy. The suppression of German-American culture was so thorough that it amounted to cultural genocide. German-language newspapers were banned, German music was removed from concert halls, and German-language instruction was eliminated from public schools where it had been the second most taught language. Historian Frederick Luebke noted in Bonds of Loyalty that German shepherd dogs were killed in the streets, sauerkraut was renamed Liberty Cabbage, and hamburgers became Liberty Steaks. This wasn't patriotic enthusiasm. It was systematic cultural erasure designed to eliminate any potential source of divided loyalty. But perhaps the most shameful aspect of America's war effort was the treatment of African American soldiers, whose service and sacrifice has been deliberately minimized in popular accounts of the conflict. Over 350,000 African Americans served in the military during World War I, yet they faced systematic discrimination that violated every principle for which America claimed to be fighting. The War Department stipulated that no more than 1/4 of the trainees in any army camp could be African American, effectively limiting their participation even when they volunteered enthusiastically. At training facilities like Camp Sherman in Ohio and Camp Lee in Virginia, black soldiers were denied proper uniforms, forced to sleep in tents while white soldiers occupied barracks, and subjected to verbal and physical abuse from white officers who saw their service as an affront to racial hierarchy. When these soldiers reached France, they encountered a level of racial prejudice from their own commanders that shocked even European observers. General John J. Pershing, commander of the American Expeditionary Forces, issued secret instructions to French commanders warning them not to treat African American troops as equals. According to documents discovered in French military archives, American officers told French civilians that black soldiers had tails like animals and should be avoided. The 369th Infantry Regiment, known as the Harlem Hellfighters, spent 191 days in frontline trenches, longer than any other American unit of comparable size. They suffered over 1,400 casualties and never lost ground to the enemy. The French government awarded 171 members of the regiment the Croix de Guerre, their highest military honour. Yet when they returned to New York, they were denied permission to participate in victory parades with white units. These men had proven their courage under conditions that would have broken lesser soldiers, yet they returned to a country that refused to acknowledge their service. The contradiction was so stark that it helped fuel what historians call the New Negro movement, the intellectual and cultural awakening that would eventually become the Harlem Renaissance. The war's impact on American women represents another carefully obscured chapter in this hidden history. While popular accounts focus on women entering the workforce as a temporary wartime measure, the reality was far more complex and permanent. Women didn't just fill vacant positions. They transformed entire industries and challenged fundamental assumptions about gender roles that had persisted for centuries. In munitions factories across the country, women operated machinery that had been considered too dangerous for the female workers. They handled explosives, operated heavy equipment, and managed production lines with a skill that amazed their male supervisors. The federal government actively recruited women for these positions through propaganda campaigns that portrayed factory work as patriotic duty equivalent to military service. Yet this transformation came with a price that has been largely ignored. Industrial accidents increased dramatically as safety standards were relaxed to meet production demands. Women worked 12-hour shifts in poorly ventilated facilities, handling toxic chemicals without adequate protection. According to Labour Department records, industrial fatalities among female workers increased by over 200% between 1917 and 1918. When the war ended, most women were expected to return to domestic roles as if their industrial service had never occurred. Those who resisted faced economic pressure and social ostracism designed to restore pre-war gender hierarchies. The skills they had developed, the confidence they had gained, and the economic independence they had achieved were treated as temporary aberrations rather than permanent social advances. The story continues to unfold with revelations that challenge everything Americans thought they knew about their role in the Great War. From the selection of the unknown soldier to the systematic suppression of dissent that would echo through every subsequent American conflict. The immigrant experience during America's Great War reveals contradictions that cut to the heart of the national identity crisis the conflict provoked. According to military records analysed by historian Nancy Gentile Ford in Americans All, Foreign-Born Soldiers in World War I, nearly 500,000 foreign-born men served in the American Expeditionary Forces, representing 18% of all enlisted personnel, despite comprising only 15% of the nation's population. These men found themselves fighting for a country that simultaneously needed their service and questioned their loyalty. The military's approach to these immigrant soldiers reflected the broader tensions of a nation struggling to define itself in global terms. At Camp Jackson in South Carolina, Captain Ralston Fleming implemented what he called militant Americanization programs designed to transform foreign-born recruits into what he termed enthusiastic American patriots. These weren't simple English classes or civics lessons. They were comprehensive cultural indoctrination programs that required immigrants to renounce not just their political allegiances, but often their cultural identities as well. The irony was inescapable. Men who had fled European militarism and authoritarian governments found themselves subject to forced Americanization programs that bore uncomfortable similarities to the nationalist movements they had sought to escape. German immigrants faced particular scrutiny, with over 2,000 German citizens imprisoned without trial, beginning in 1917 under the Enemy Alien Act. These internments occurred despite the fact that many of these men had lived in America for decades and had sons serving in the American military. At industrial facilities like Bethlehem Steel, where nearly 10,000 of the 30,000 workers were foreign-born, immigrant labour became essential to the war effort, even as immigrant loyalty remained suspect. These workers faced a double burden, producing the materials needed for American victory while enduring surveillance and suspicion from their neighbours and supervisors. According to Labour Department records, foreign-born workers faced dismissal rates 3 times higher than native-born employees for infractions that would have resulted in warnings for others. The children of immigrants found themselves caught in an even more complex web of competing loyalties and expectations. Schools across the country implemented patriotism programs that required students to demonstrate their American identity through elaborate rituals of flag worship and loyalty oaths. Children with German surnames were forced to prove their allegiance through public demonstrations that often involved denouncing their own heritage and family traditions. Yet perhaps the most revealing aspect of the immigrant experience was how quickly American society was willing to embrace foreign-born soldiers when their service served propaganda purposes. The story of Sergeant Alvin York, the Tennessee farmer who became America's most celebrated war hero, overshadowed equally remarkable achievements by immigrant soldiers whose stories didn't fit the narrative of native-born American superiority. Private Giuseppe Bellomo of the 332nd Infantry Regiment single-handedly captured 43 German soldiers during the Meuse-Argonne offensive. Yet his Medal of Honor recommendation was denied because his English was considered too poor for him to serve as an effective symbol of American heroism. First Lieutenant Abraham Krotoshinsky, a Jewish immigrant from Poland, served as a runner during the famous Lost Battalion incident and was personally commended by General Pershing. But his story was largely ignored by newspapers that preferred to focus on officers with more American backgrounds. The systematic nature of this cultural suppression extended far beyond individual discrimination into comprehensive social engineering. The teaching of foreign languages was banned in public schools across 23 states, effectively eliminating educational opportunities that had existed for generations. German-language newspapers, which had served immigrant communities for over a century, were forced to cease publication or convert to English-only formats that lost most of their readership. This cultural destruction was so thorough that it permanently altered the character of American immigration. According to sociologist John Hyam's analysis in Strangers in the Land, the war marked the end of America's genuinely pluralistic approach to immigrant assimilation and the beginning of what he termed 100% Americanism, a cultural conformity that would shape immigration policy for decades to come. The medical innovations that emerged from battlefield necessity represent another deliberately obscured aspect of America's war effort. While popular accounts focus on the development of new weapons and military technologies, the advances in medical care and surgical techniques had far more lasting impact on American society. The establishment of the first systematic blood banking system, developed by Army medical officers to treat wounded soldiers, revolutionized civilian healthcare and laid the foundation for modern emergency medicine. Captain Harold Gillies, a British surgeon working with American medical units, pioneered the field of reconstructive surgery in response to the horrific facial injuries caused by modern artillery. His techniques, developed in military hospitals behind the lines, would transform civilian medicine and create entirely new medical specialties. According to medical historian Thomas Scotland in The Medical War, American military hospitals became laboratories for surgical innovations that would benefit civilian populations for generations. Yet these medical advances came at a cost that military authorities worked to conceal from the American public. The scale of psychiatric casualties, what was then termed shell shock and would later be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder, overwhelmed military medical facilities and challenged fundamental assumptions about masculine courage and psychological resilience. Army medical records, classified until the 1960s, revealed that over 40,000 American soldiers suffered what would now be recognized as severe psychological trauma requiring long-term treatment. The military's response to these psychological casualties reflected broader societal attitudes toward mental health and masculine identity. Soldiers diagnosed with shell shock were often treated as cowards or malingerers rather than casualties of war. Many were subjected to treatment that amounted to psychological torture, including electrical shock therapy and forced exposure to combat conditions designed to shame them back into fighting effectiveness. Dr. Thomas Salmon, the Army's chief psychiatric consultant, documented cases of soldiers who had been subjected to these treatments and emerged with permanent psychological damage that made civilian reintegration impossible. His reports, suppressed during the war and released only decades later, revealed a systematic pattern of medical abuse that violated every principle of ethical treatment. The human cost of America's industrial mobilization extended far beyond the battlefield into the factories, shipyards, and munitions plants that powered the war effort. The War Industries Board, created to coordinate production, operated with powers that would have been unthinkable in peacetime. Private companies were required to accept government contracts at prices set by federal bureaucrats. Labor unions were co-opted into the war effort through promises of improved working conditions that were largely abandoned once the fighting ended. The National War Labor Board established the 8-hour workday and recognized the right to organize. But these concessions came with restrictions that effectively neutered organized labor as an independent political force. Strikes were prohibited as unpatriotic, and union leaders who challenged government policies faced prosecution under the Espionage Act. According to labor historian David Montgomery, in The Fall of the House of Labor, the war marked the end of the militant labor movement that had emerged in the late 19th century and the beginning of a more compliant relationship between organized labor and corporate power. The environmental consequences of wartime production represent perhaps the most completely suppressed aspect of the entire conflict. Munitions factories across the country discharged toxic chemicals into rivers and groundwater systems without any regulatory oversight. The DuPont Company's explosives plants in Delaware and New Jersey created environmental contamination that would not be fully documented until the 1970s, when cancer rates in surrounding communities were found to be significantly higher than national averages. Coal production increased by over 40% during the war years, accelerating the environmental degradation that had already begun to transform entire regions of Appalachia into industrial wastelands. Strip mining operations expanded without environmental safeguards, creating ecological damage that persists more than a century later. According to environmental historian Donald Worster in Under Western Skies, the war marked the beginning of what he termed the industrial conquest of nature, a systematic exploitation of natural resources that prioritized short-term production over long-term environmental sustainability. The story of America's entry into World War I cannot be understood without examining the complex web of international financial relationships that made neutrality impossible long before the first German submarine attacked an American vessel. The Federal Reserve, established just 4 years before the war began, found itself managing a global financial system that connected American prosperity to Allied victory in ways that few Americans understood or approved. The transformation of American society during World War I established patterns of government power, corporate influence, and social control that would define the modern American state. The techniques of propaganda and mass persuasion developed by the Committee on Public Information became the foundation for modern advertising and political communication. The suppression of civil liberties under the Espionage and Sedition Acts created legal precedents that would be invoked during every subsequent national emergency. The systematic discrimination against African American soldiers established patterns of military segregation that would persist until the Korean War. Yet perhaps the most profound legacy of America's Great War was the demonstration that democratic societies could mobilize human and material resources on a scale that rivaled totalitarian states, but only by temporarily abandoning many of the principles that distinguish democracy from authoritarianism. The question that haunted thoughtful observers then, and should haunt us now, was whether a society could engage in total war without fundamentally altering its character in ways that made victory indistinguishable from defeat. The aftermath of America's Great War extended far beyond the November 1918 armistice, creating ripple effects that would reshape the nation in ways that remain largely unexamined in popular historical accounts. The demobilization process itself became a masterclass in social engineering, as government officials grappled with the challenge of reintegrating 4 million veterans into a civilian economy that had fundamentally changed during their absence. The War Department's demobilization plans, according to historian Jennifer Keene's research in Doughboys, the Great War and the Remaking of America, were designed not merely to discharge soldiers, but to control the narrative of their service. Veterans were required to sign agreements that prohibited them from discussing certain aspects of their overseas experience, particularly incidents involving racial violence, medical experiments, and the treatment of shell-shock cases. These agreements weren't merely bureaucratic formalities. They represented a systematic effort to sanitize the historical record before it could be written. Veterans who violated these agreements faced the loss of medical benefits and disability payments, creating a powerful incentive for silence that persisted for decades. According to declassified Veterans Administration documents, over 12,000 veterans had their benefits suspended between 1919 and 1925 for violations that included speaking publicly about their wartime experiences. The economic dimensions of demobilization revealed the extent to which the war had created new forms of corporate power that would define the American economy for generations. Companies that had profited enormously from government contracts during the war used their accumulated capital to acquire competitors and consolidate entire industries. According to economic historian James Weinstein's analysis in The Corporate Ideal in the Liberal State, the war accelerated corporate consolidation by at least 2 decades, creating monopolistic structures that would have taken much longer to develop under normal market conditions. The DuPont Company, which had seen its profits increase by over 900% during the war, used its wartime gains to diversify into chemicals, plastics, and synthetic materials that would transform American manufacturing. General Motors, which had produced military vehicles and aircraft engines, emerged from the war with the financial resources and technical expertise to dominate the automotive industry for the next half-century. These corporate transformations occurred with direct government assistance that violated traditional American principles of free market competition. The War Industries Board's price-setting mechanisms had effectively eliminated competitive bidding for major contracts, allowing established companies to accumulate profits without the normal risks of market competition. According to Federal Trade Commission records, companies that held major war contracts saw their average profit margins increase by 240% between 1917 and 1919, while companies without government contracts saw their margins decline by an average of 15%. The human cost of this economic transformation was borne primarily by returning veterans who found themselves competing for jobs in an economy that had been restructured to benefit capital rather than labor. The promised bonuses for military service were delayed for years, forcing many veterans into debt and unemployment. According to Labor Department statistics, unemployment among veterans reached 23% by 1921, nearly double the rate for civilians who had remained on the home front. The treatment of disabled veterans revealed perhaps the most cynical aspect of the entire demobilization process. Men who had been celebrated as heroes while they were needed for military service were treated as burdens once their usefulness ended. The Veterans Bureau, predecessor to the modern Veterans Administration, was systematically underfunded and staffed with administrators who viewed disability claims with suspicion rather than sympathy. Dr. William Menninger, who worked with shell shock victims during the 1920s, documented cases of veterans who had been denied disability benefits despite clear evidence of psychological trauma that prevented them from maintaining employment. His confidential reports, released only in the 1970s under Freedom of Information Act requests, revealed that Veterans Bureau officials had been instructed to deny psychological disability claims whenever possible, regardless of medical evidence. The racial dimensions of veteran treatment exposed contradictions that would fuel civil rights activism for decades. African American veterans returned home expecting that their military service would earn them improved treatment in civilian society, only to discover that their uniforms made them targets rather than symbols of honor. According to NAACP records compiled by historian Chad Williams in Torchbearers of Democracy, over 400 African American veterans were lynched or murdered between 1919 and 1923, many while wearing their military uniforms. The Red Summer of 1919 saw racial violence erupted in cities across the country, often triggered by white resentment of African American veterans who refused to accept the subordinate roles they had occupied before the war. In Chicago, Washington, D.C., and dozens of smaller communities, white mobs attacked black veterans who were perceived as threatening the racial hierarchy that the war was supposed to have left unchanged. These attacks weren't spontaneous outbursts of racial hatred, but coordinated campaigns designed to reassert white supremacy in the face of black military service that had challenged fundamental assumptions about racial capability and courage. According to FBI files, declassified in the 1980s, local law enforcement agencies often coordinated with white supremacist organizations to identify and target African American veterans who were considered uppity or unwilling to accept traditional racial boundaries. The international implications of America's racial violence became a source of diplomatic embarrassment that government officials worked desperately to suppress. French newspapers published detailed accounts of lynchings and racial attacks that contradicted America's wartime propaganda about fighting for democracy and human rights. According to State Department cables discovered in the National Archives, American diplomats in Europe spent considerable effort trying to suppress foreign press coverage of domestic racial violence. The women who had transformed American industry during the war faced their own form of systematic exclusion from the post-war economy. Factory owners who had praised female workers as patriotic heroes during the conflict suddenly discovered that these same women were unsuited for industrial work once male veterans needed jobs. According to historian Maureen Greenwald's research in Women, War and Work, over 750,000 women were dismissed from industrial jobs between November 1918 and June 1919, often with less than a week's notice. The dismissals weren't based on performance or capability, but on ideological assumptions about gender roles that the war had temporarily suspended, but never fundamentally challenged. Women who protested their dismissals were branded as unpatriotic and selfish, accused of taking jobs away from men who had served their country in combat. Union leaders who had welcomed female membership during the labor shortage suddenly argued that women's continued employment would undermine wage standards and working conditions. The psychological impact of these dismissals extended far beyond individual economic hardship into questions of national purpose and identity that women's wartime service had raised. According to survey data collected by the Women's Bureau of the Labor Department, many former factory workers reported feeling betrayed by a country that had asked for their service during crisis, but rejected their contributions during peace. The technological innovations that emerged from wartime necessity created new industries and transformed existing ones in ways that government planners had never anticipated. The mass production techniques developed for manufacturing military equipment were quickly adapted to civilian goods, creating the foundation for the consumer economy that would define American prosperity in the 1920s. The aviation industry, which had barely existed before the war, emerged as a major force in American manufacturing and transportation. Companies like Boeing and Lockheed, which had produced military aircraft during the conflict, used their technical expertise and government connections to develop commercial aviation markets that would revolutionize American transportation and commerce. The chemical industry experienced even more dramatic transformation, as companies that had produced explosives and poison gas for military use adapted their facilities to manufacture synthetic materials, pharmaceuticals, and agricultural chemicals. According to industrial historian David Noble's analysis in America by Design, the war accelerated the development of industrial chemistry by at least a generation, creating new products and processes that would transform everything from agriculture to medicine. Yet these technological advances came with environmental and social costs that were largely ignored during the rush to convert military innovations to civilian use. Chemical plants that had operated without environmental controls during the war continued these practices in peacetime, creating pollution problems that wouldn't be fully recognized until decades later. According to Environmental Protection Agency studies conducted in the 1970s, many communities near former military production facilities showed elevated rates of cancer and other diseases that could be traced to wartime industrial activities. The cultural transformation of American society during and after the war established patterns of mass communication and social control that would define the modern American experience. The propaganda techniques developed by the Committee on Public Information were quickly adapted by advertising agencies and political organizations that recognized their effectiveness in shaping public opinion and consumer behavior. Edward Bernays, who had worked for the CPY during the war, founded what he called the engineering of consent, using psychological manipulation techniques to influence public opinion on behalf of corporate and political clients. According to his own writings in Propaganda and The Engineering of Consent, Bernays viewed the American public as irrational and easily manipulated, requiring guidance from experts who understood the techniques of mass persuasion. The success of wartime propaganda had demonstrated that democratic societies could be controlled through psychological manipulation rather than physical coercion, a discovery that would reshape American politics and commerce for the remainder of the 20th century. According to media historian Stuart Ewan in Captains of Consciousness, the advertising industry that emerged from the war represented a fundamental shift from providing information about products to creating psychological needs that could be satisfied through consumption. The educational system that had been mobilized to support the war effort was permanently altered by the experience, with curricula and teaching methods designed to produce citizens who were patriotic, compliant, and unquestioning of authority. History textbooks were rewritten to emphasize American virtue and minimize discussion of controversial aspects of the nation's past, creating sanitized narratives that persisted for generations. According to educational historian Joel Spring in The American School, the war marked the beginning of systematic efforts to use public education for social engineering purposes, with schools expected to produce citizens who would support government policies and corporate interests rather than think critically about social and political issues. The selection of America's unknown soldier represents perhaps the most carefully orchestrated aspect of the entire post-war memory project. The process, described in detail by military historian Patrick O'Donnell in The Unknowns, was designed not merely to honor the war dead, but to create a symbol that would validate the entire war effort while obscuring its more troubling aspects. 4 unidentified bodies were transported from different battlefields to a special ceremony at Chalon-sur-Marne, where Sergeant Edward Younger was instructed to select one coffin by placing a spray of white roses on it. According to declassified military records, the selection process was carefully choreographed to ensure maximum symbolic impact, with each step designed to reinforce messages about sacrifice, honor, and national purpose. The chosen soldier was transported to Arlington National Cemetery with elaborate ceremonies that drew hundreds of thousands of spectators and extensive media coverage. The tomb of the unknown soldier became a pilgrimage site that channeled public grief and memory in directions that supported official narratives about the war's meaning and necessity. Yet, the very need for an unknown soldier revealed the extent to which the war had created casualties, whose identities, like their stories, had been deliberately obscured. According to Quartermaster Corps records, over 4,000 American soldiers remained unidentified at the war's end. Their bodies too damaged or their circumstances too compromising to allow for proper identification and burial. The medical innovations that emerged from battlefield necessity continued to influence American healthcare long after the war ended, but often in ways that reflected the same prejudices and power structures that had shaped military medicine. The blood banking techniques developed to treat wounded soldiers were adapted to civilian hospitals, but access to these innovations was limited by race and class in ways that perpetuated existing inequalities. The America that emerged from the Great War was not the same nation that had entered it in April 1917. The transformation was complete, irreversible, and largely hidden from public view. The techniques of mass persuasion, the suppression of dissent, the systematic exploitation of racial and economic divisions had created a template for modern American power that would be refined and perfected through every subsequent conflict. The heroes who returned home discovered that their service had been used not to defend democracy, but to fundamentally alter it, creating a society where corporate interests, government propaganda, and social control had merged into something that resembled the authoritarian systems they thought they had been fighting against. The untold story of World War I reveals that America's greatest victory may have been its most profound defeat, and the price of that victory continues to shape our world today.